I've been playing a lot of Last Epoch lately. It's a really good new action role-playing game. While I've been playing it, it's made me reflect a lot. Most of all, I realized that, you know what? We could never have made a game like Last Epoch. Let's talk about why. Let's start with the skill system, because even though Last Epoch is wildly complicated, I actually think that's what most action role-playing gamers want. Like I said, the Last Epoch system is wildly complicated. Not only do you have your passives that you get to pick every time you level up, you have a subclass that you're fixed into, which you can then also spend passives into. Spending passives unlocks even more skills. And then on top of that, you have the active skills and all of the complexity and subclassing that you can focus on and specialize in within a skill itself. This is incredible. It basically allows you to tailor and build a very, very specific class. And it also gives you this promise of endless opportunities to explore and customize. We erred away from that. We kept a much simpler stat system that was more clearly aligned. It was easy to identify, like, okay, I'm a barbarian, I want these. And we thought that that was the right choice to make. Looking back, maybe it wasn't. Especially for the launch of Diablo 3, we just didn't focus on the end game enough, hardly at all. Almost all of our focus was put onto the level up experience, specifically 1 through 4 acts in normal difficulty, and the story and the narrative component to it. Last Epoch's endgame is really solid. It kind of combines a lot of things from, it learns a lot from Path of Exile. It feels like it's a natural extension of the game. In fact, in some way, I kind of just wish that I went straight there as opposed to having to go through the narrative campaign. It's like, just get me to the end game. That seems more fun. On Diablo 3, we didn't really focus on an end game as we were developing it. Most of our effort was focused solely on acts 1 through 4 in normal difficulty. Most of it was focused on telling an amazing story. To be completely honest, we were quite late in development before we really started testing it. I remember pretty clearly, I was playing at home. My oldest son had just been born, so I was allowed to take a laptop home and play from home and do play testing. And I remember I defeated Diablo, and then I was supposed to just transition into the next difficulty, and it just broke. And I'm like, okay, I guess we haven't gotten here yet. And this is actually honestly, this is a year and a half out from shipping. We also didn't do any kind of public test of the end game of Diablo. A lot of this was due to concerns of releasing the story too early. But looking back, I think it was probably a mistake not to even just put it out there and let people test it in some way, shape, or form, even if it was in a limited way. I think we would have learned so much more rather than waiting to release and having to fix or try and solve problems on the fly in a live environment. Our assumption was that people would play Diablo 3 in the same way that they played Diablo 2. But the reality is, there was a lot of years between D2 and D3. Gaming landscape had changed. MMOs had come out. There was a whole new way of playing games in that kind of way at the end game. And our audience was different as well. They hit this point where in D2, it would have been natural to go, oh, I can't beat this. I need to go back into earlier content in order to farm gear. The players that we were targeting, the broad audience that we suddenly had, they didn't play that way. They got to a certain point, they died, and they realized, well, I just need to try again, and hammer their face against it. And that wasn't the right solve. We were kind of relying on this D2 mentality that probably just didn't exist anymore. This one always gets me, and it makes it actually kind of hard for me to play games sometimes that don't do this well. And it's the responsiveness of abilities. In fact, I think the reason why Diablo 3 was so successful for so long, withstanding all the challenges of, bad loot and the auction house and the launch issues, all that sort of stuff, and no endgame, is because the moment to moment actually just feels amazing. And we spent so much time working on that. Diablo kind of ruined it for me for almost every other game, because the first thing I do is I'm like, okay, what does it feel like to click this ability and then try and cast another ability? How closely tied are they? Do I feel like there's lag involved? Diablo 3 nails that really well. This is actually something, I mean, Diablo 4, it kind of bugs me. Like, Diablo 4 doesn't do it this well. It's probably my biggest complaint about Diablo 4 is that they don't have that same responsiveness of abilities. A good test for this is, can you stutter step? Can you like move in one direction, cast in another, move in one direction, cast in another? Or can you be casting like a chain lightning spell and then interweave another spell without having to feel like you need to stop casting entirely and then start clicking and cast the next one intentionally? There are all these different features that we put in place. We had interrupts like tied to keyframes on the animations. There was a really clever spell queuing system that a couple of the engineers put together. Well, there you have it. Key takeaway as to why Last Epoch is a game that the Diablo team could never have made. So I think technically they could have. They absolutely could have. They're some of the most talented game developers I've ever met in my entire life. I thought I was a good game designer until I joined that team, and then I realized I was terrible because I was working next to some of the best people in the world. So they could have designed and implemented the complex systems. They could have approached and solved these problems in all these different ways. But fundamentally, our audience was different. We were trying to target a much broader audience than what just the original Diablo audience was. We wanted to bring the game to many more players. In order to do that, you just have to, there's the trade-off. You have to remove some of that complexity. The broader audience is not going to, they're going to bounce off if you create a really complicated skill tree system for them to try and engage in. They're just going to think it's too hard. They're not going to really stick around long enough to see the benefit of it. Let's talk about crafting. In Last Epoch, it fills a really interesting hole in the action role-playing game. Because of the way that you can use crafting to kind of build an item off of a base item by leaning on or using their crafting material to focus the crafting on specific assets, or maybe just replace an affix that you didn't like or that rolled, it opens the potential of what an item can be, as opposed to it just being, I'm going to salvage it and replace it. For Diablo 3, our crafting system there was much more of just a way for you to randomly create items. Some with fixed stats, but really the fixed stats were pretty limited. You didn't have many choices, and then everything else was random. It was basically just like the ability to spawn a creature in front of you and then kill it and get it to spawn out loot. The Last Epoch crafting system, it kind of expands your mental filter on what a good item is. You're not just looking for a good item for your current character. Not just an up arrow, right? Like, you're kind of evaluating almost every item, not only on what just rolled, but also on what it has the potential to be. For us, for the crafting, the focus was much more around it being an alternative funnel for all the items that were being created. If you imagine the full economy of Diablo 3, especially at peak, there were billions of items being created every second. Well, how do you get those items out of the economy without them all just turning into gold or turning into trash on an auction house? Well, crafting is a viable solution because you can break it down into salvage. It's not a one-to-one thing. It's always lossy. And then you craft a new thing, which is, again, always lossy. The problem is there just wasn't really a motivation to do it. I did the design for the crafting, so I'm fully happy to own all the grief and bad comments. Flood the comment thing below with all the negative thoughts that you had about the original crafting system for Diablo. I'll probably just thumbs up and agree with all of them. The reality is we just didn't have time to iterate on it. Even in the world of Blizzard's done when it's done, there is still a it's done enough kind of phase. It just depends on the scale of the feature. It was planned for us to iterate on the crafting system for the expansion, but again, it took a lower priority once we realized the strength of adventure mode and the different systems that were being suggested, which kind of filled the gap of what crafting was trying to do. Trading support. Oh man, Last Epoch nails this. Their trading system is super robust. You basically have two different factions that you can choose, and then progression within each faction. The factions are kind of designed for this player wants to use an auction house, or they call it the barter system, I think. Tell me if I'm wrong there. They also have like a self-found progression or reputation that you can lean into, which modifies, allows you to target like certain types of items. So again, we came back to, well, what's the best way to provide players with this way to trade in the way that they're doing right now, but in a safe environment? And we came to the auction house. This also led to a lot of decisions around the real money auction house. If players were actively out there buying gold for real money, well, let them do that. Why not? But we have made so many mistakes with the auction house, it wasn't even funny. I think the biggest mistake that we made was we just didn't make items bind on equip, or at the very least, bind on trade. That would have mitigated so many of the problems. The end game, that end result, that's always a moving target because it's probably not actually what you want players to spend the most time doing, is when they're fully kitted out, they're fully geared up, they can do whatever they want. They can clear all the content within seconds. What's the fun left then? If we say, player hits level 60, they're going to use the auction house to buy Act 2 gear. Okay, well then we need to make everything hard. Or Act 4 gear at worst. Okay, well then everything else needs to be way harder. Then you end up with wasps that kill you like this. Then you end up with elites that are like just constantly hammering at you, and players are hammering themselves at the content again and again and again. And this is actually like the worst for the players who don't even want to engage in the auction house. They're just like, man, I'm running out of money. I can't repair my gear. I'm constantly dying because I can't get better items. What do I do? And it kind of sucked that the solution to that was, oh, you should go to the auction house. It's not great.